At 11:40 p.m., ship's time, a wireless operator sitting at a cramped desk 2 decks below the bridge was interrupted mid-message by an incoming signal from a nearby ship. The signal said, "Ice." He had already logged 6 warnings that day. 6 separate vessels over the course of the 14th of April, 1912, had radioed word of ice ahead. Pack ice, field ice, icebergs sighted directly in the shipping lane. He was tired. He was behind on a backlog of passenger telegrams, messages to be sent ashore once they came within range, personal notes, stock updates, dinner reservations for people who would be in New York in 4 days and wanted everything arranged before they arrived. He was, by every account given afterward, doing his job exactly as it had always been done. Passenger traffic first, navigational chatter logged and passed along when convenient. This was, in 1912, an entirely reasonable way to prioritize the work of a wireless operator, because wireless itself was barely a decade into commercial use, and nobody in the shipping industry had yet fully reckoned with what it meant that a piece of novelty equipment, installed largely to let wealthy passengers send frivolous messages home, had quietly become the single most important safety instrument on the ship. I want you to picture the wireless room itself for a moment, because I think it matters. Not a bridge, not a command center. A small cabin, barely large enough for the equipment and the 2 men who operated it in shifts. Walls lined with the specialized gear of a technology still young enough that most passengers considered it a novelty rather than a necessity. The operators worked long hours for modest pay, employed not by the shipping line itself, but by a separate wireless communications company, which meant their chain of command didn't run cleanly through the ship's own officers at all. That detail matters more than it might seem. A warning about ice, however urgent, had to travel from a room technically outside the ship's own command structure, carried by hand by a tired man, to a bridge that had no guaranteed reason to treat it as more important than anything else arriving that hour. The nearby ship interrupting him for the 7th time that day was smaller, slower, stopped for the night, in fact. Surrounded by ice, it had decided not to risk crossing in the dark. Its own wireless operator, a young man working largely alone, had watched the ice thicken around his ship through the afternoon and evening, made the sensible decision to stop rather than push forward blind, and was now doing the responsible thing, warning every ship in range that the water ahead of them was not water they wanted to be crossing at full speed in the dark. He told them, in words he would spend the rest of his short life accounting for, that he was busy and that they should stop interrupting. 20 minutes later, the ship he was working on struck an iceberg. I want to tell you what that felt like for most of the 2,200 people aboard, because it is not what you think, and it is not what films have taught you to expect. It did not feel like a collision. It felt, to most passengers, like almost nothing at all. A shudder, a faint grinding sound, distant, more felt in the soles of the feet than heard. Some people slept through it entirely. Some, playing cards in the smoking room, felt the ship tremble slightly and joked about it before returning to their hands. A few passengers later described stepping out of their cabins simply curious about the odd sensation, expecting to find nothing more than an unusual vibration from the engines, and finding instead deck crew already beginning, quietly and without yet alarming anyone, to inspect the lower decks. One account I want to share because I think it captures the strangeness of that first half hour better than almost anything else. A passenger in first class later recalled that the ship's orchestra, which had been playing in one of the lounges that evening, simply kept playing for a while after the collision because nobody had told them to stop, and because the sensation on deck genuinely hadn't seemed severe enough to warrant it. The famous image of the band playing as the ship went down has become one of the most mythologized details of this entire story. What's less often said
is that in the first 30 minutes, they weren't playing out of heroism or resignation. They were playing because, as far as anyone could tell in that moment, nothing had happened that required them to stop.
I want to describe the mood on deck in those first minutes a little further, because I think it explains so much of what came afterward. Several survivors described an almost festive quality to the earliest evacuation. People in evening dress, some carrying drinks they hadn't finished, treating the exercise of boarding lifeboats as an inconvenient but temporary interruption to their evening. Nobody dressed for a genuine emergency. Nobody grabbed only essentials. The scale of what was actually happening simply hadn't caught up with what people could see and feel around them. And it wouldn't, for most of them, until the ship's angle in the water became impossible to ignore. A very large, very new ship, built to a standard its own builders believed made it close to unsinkable, had just been fatally wounded by something that felt, to almost everyone aboard, like nothing worth interrupting an evening for. It was called the Titanic. In 2 hours and 40 minutes, it would be gone. You're listening to The Final Frequency, last broadcast. And tonight, for the first time in 5 episodes, I'm taking you somewhere other than Chernobyl. I said, at the close of that arc, that there were other silences. Other places where something happened and an official story was built to contain it. And the gap between what happened and what was said has never been fully closed. I meant it. This is where I'm taking you first. The RMS Titanic sank in the early hours of April 15th, 1912, on its maiden voyage from Southampton to New York. Somewhere between 1,500 and 1,520 people died. The exact number has never been settled with full confidence, partly because the passenger lists themselves were incomplete, and partly for reasons that will become relevant later in this arc. You know the shape of this story. Almost everyone does. The unsinkable ship, the iceberg, the band that kept playing. I am not going to spend 5 episodes retelling the story you already know. I am going to spend 5 episodes telling you the story underneath it. The warnings that were received and set aside. The safety equipment that existed and wasn't used correctly, or wasn't used at all. The ship, less than 20 miles away, that could plausibly have saved most of the people who died, and didn't, because one man went to bed. The inquiry that gave 2 different countries 2 different official truths. And the wreck itself, found in 1985, visited ever since, and 2 years ago, the site of a second disaster that killed 5 more people who went looking for the first one. I want to say something about why I chose to follow Chernobyl with this story specifically, rather than something closer in time or closer in cause. On the surface, a nuclear disaster in Soviet Ukraine and a passenger liner sinking in the North Atlantic 74 years earlier don't have much in common. But I think they share the same underlying shape once you look past the surface details. A system that believed, with real institutional confidence, that it had engineered away its own worst-case scenario. A series of small, individually defensible decisions that combined into something none of the individual decision-makers would have chosen if they'd seen the whole picture at once. And, afterward, an inquiry process that produced an official account shaped as much by what different parties needed to be true as by what had actually happened. Chernobyl had, do not use the word accident. I think the Titanic has its own version of that phrase. I just don't think anyone has ever said it as plainly as that Soviet official did. which is part of why this story has survived for over a century as tragedy rather than as the accountability story I think it actually is. I want to spend a moment on why I think that framing matters, beyond simply being a stylistic choice for this broadcast. When a disaster gets remembered as tragedy, the questions people ask about it tend to be questions about fate, about human frailty in the face of the sea, about the impossibility of foreseeing every danger. Those are real and worthwhile questions. But they're also, conveniently, questions that don't require anyone specific to answer for anything specific. When a disaster gets remembered as an accountability story instead, the questions change. Who decided the ship didn't need enough lifeboats? Who decided a stockbroker's telegram outranked an ice warning? Who decided that maintaining speed through a known ice field was worth the risk it carried? I think the second set of questions is harder to sit with, and I think that's exactly why the first version has been the one that survived. I want to name something else, too, before I move into the details of that night. This series has always tried to hold two things at once: respect for the scale of human loss, and a refusal to let that scale become an excuse for vagueness about cause. I think it would be easy, with a story this famous, to simply repeat the well-worn emotional beats and call it done. I'm not going to do that tonight, and I'm not going to do it across this arc. Every person aboard that ship deserves the same careful accounting this frequency has tried to give to every other disaster it's covered. Tonight is the night itself. What actually happened, in the order it actually happened, stripped of the mythology that's built up around it for over a century. This is Last Broadcast. This is the Titanic. I want to start with a detail most people have never heard, because I think it says more about how this disaster happened than almost anything else that night. There were 2 lookouts stationed in the crow's nest that evening. Their job was simple: watch the sea ahead, in the dark, without instruments, and report anything unusual. It is one of the oldest jobs on any ship, and it depends on one piece of equipment above all others: binoculars. The Titanic had a pair, secured for the lookout's use in a locked cabinet. The key to that cabinet belonged to an officer who had been reassigned off the ship days before it departed Southampton. A routine last-minute personnel change, the kind that happens on every voyage, on every ship, without incident, almost every single time. This time, he left with the key still in his pocket. Frederick Fleet, one of the 2 lookouts on duty that night, testified afterward, at the inquiry that followed, under oath, in front of people whose job was to establish exactly what had gone wrong, that he and his fellow lookout had no binoculars for the entire crossing. They were watching the North Atlantic, at night, in a season known for icebergs, with their unaided eyes. When asked later whether binoculars would have allowed him to see the iceberg sooner, Fleet's answer was direct. He said they would have. I want to be careful here, because a single overlooked key is a small, almost absurd detail to hang a disaster on, and I don't think it's fair to suggest that binoculars alone would have saved the ship. The iceberg was seen. It was seen with enough time, by most accounts, for the ship to have avoided it entirely, if the response had been different, or perhaps not seen it in time at all, even with better optics. Historians have argued this for over a century, and I'm not going to pretend the argument is settled. What I want you to sit with is smaller than that. A key in the wrong pocket, on the wrong ship, on the one crossing where it might have mattered. That is how most disasters actually happen. Not with one dramatic failure. With a key someone forgot to hand over on an ordinary Wednesday that nobody thought was worth double-checking. I keep returning to that phrase, nobody thought was worth double-checking, because I think it applies to almost every failure in this story, not just the key. The wireless cue, the lifeboat drill that never happened, the speed maintained through the ice field. Each one on its own was a thing nobody thought was worth double-checking. Right up until the one night it turned out to be the only thing that mattered. I want to add one more detail to this, something I learned only recently while researching this episode that I think deepens the strangeness of it rather than resolving it. The officer who left with the key, his name was David Blair, and he'd actually been part of the Titanic's crew for the delivery voyage from the shipbuilder to Southampton before being reassigned off at the last moment to make room for a more senior officer joining the maiden voyage crew. He kept a diary, and in an entry written before he learned what would happen, he described his disappointment at being removed from what he expected to be an exciting, historic voyage. He had no idea, writing that entry, that the key in his pocket would matter more than anything else about his brief time aboard. I want to sit with the specific irony of that diary entry for a moment, because I think it captures something true about how disasters like this one actually unfold. Blair wasn't careless. He wasn't negligent. He was, by every account, simply a man going through the ordinary disappointment of a last-minute reassignment, packing his things in a hurry, focused entirely on his own disrupted plans, rather than on a small brass key that, in the confusion of departure, never made it back to the ship. I don't think Blair ever fully learned what that key meant. Some accounts suggest he lived the rest of his life without knowing the lookouts had gone without binoculars because of him. I find that detail almost harder to sit with than anything else in this section. The idea that the man at the center of this particular thread of the story may never have understood his own part in it.
I want to be clear that Fleet and his fellow lookout weren't passive about the absence either. Fleet raised the issue with an officer before the ship even left Southampton, asking about binoculars for the crow's nest and being told, essentially, that none were available. He didn't know, at the time, that a pair existed in a locked cabinet a short walk away, sealed behind a lock whose only key had already left the ship in another man's pocket. He simply accepted the answer he was given, the way a junior crew member accepts most answers given by an officer, and went to work with the only tools he actually had, his own two eyes, staring into darkness for hours at a time on the coldest night of the crossing. I told you, at the start of this broadcast, that 6 ice warnings had reached the Titanic's wireless room over the course of that day. I want to walk through what happened to those warnings, because the answer is not that they disappeared. It's stranger than that. Some reached the bridge and were acted on in a limited way. Officers acknowledged the presence of ice ahead and adjusted their attention accordingly. Some were logged, but not immediately relayed to the men actually steering the ship, sitting instead in a stack of messages waiting to be walked from the wireless room to the bridge whenever someone had a moment to make the trip. And at least one, the most specific and most urgent, sent that evening from a ship called the Californian, giving a precise position for pack ice directly in the Titanic's path, never reached the bridge at all. It was the warning cut short by the wireless operator I described at the start of this broadcast. Busy with passenger traffic, told to stop interrupting. I want to be fair to that operator, because I think the instinct to make him a villain is too easy, and too easy villains are usually a sign that the real story is being simplified. He was doing the job as it had been defined for him. Wireless technology on passenger liners in 1912 was still relatively new, still primarily understood by shipping companies as a service for wealthy passengers, not as a safety-critical navigational tool. nobody had told him that this particular ice warning outranked a stockbroker's telegram. There was no formal protocol distinguishing an urgent navigational warning from routine chatter. Both arrived as the same kind of message, in the same queue, decided by the same tired judgment at the end of a long working day. Nobody had told him, because the system hadn't yet decided that it should. The ship maintained its speed, near the maximum it was capable of, on a calm, clear, moonless night in a known ice field, having received 6 separate warnings over the preceding hours. This was not, at the time, considered an unusual or reckless decision. It reflected an industry-wide confidence shared by captains across the North Atlantic shipping lanes that a sufficiently large, sufficiently modern vessel could simply see danger coming in time to react, and that reducing speed for every reported ice field would make transatlantic crossings unworkably slow. There is a specific kind of institutional failure that doesn't look like negligence from the inside. It looks like business as usual. Nobody on that bridge believed they were taking an extraordinary risk. They believed they were doing exactly what every liner captain of the era did on every crossing, because the ships of the era were built with enough confidence in their own construction that speed through ice fields wasn't considered reckless. It was considered normal. Normal until the one night it wasn't. I think that word, normal, is doing more work in this story than almost any other. Nothing about that night looked abnormal to the people living through its first hours. Not the warnings, not the speed, not the calm sea. It only became abnormal in retrospect, once the outcome forced everyone to look back and ask which of those normal decisions should have been treated as the exception. I want to add some context about the wider industry practice at the time, because I think it helps explain why nobody involved that night considered themselves to be doing anything unusual. Shipping companies competed fiercely on speed. A fast Atlantic crossing was genuine commercial prestige, the kind of achievement that got written up in newspapers and used in advertising for years afterward. The Titanic itself wasn't attempting to set a speed record on this particular voyage, by most accounts, but it was still operating within a culture that treated maintained speed through variable conditions as the mark of a well-run ship and a competent crew. Slowing down for ice warnings in that culture wasn't the safe default. It was the thing you did only when the danger felt undeniable. And by the time the danger on this particular night felt undeniable, there were only a few seconds left to react to it.
I've also learned, researching this episode, that the night itself had one further complication that made the ice genuinely harder to spot than usual, independent of anything anyone did or failed to do. The sea that night was almost perfectly calm. Flat, glassy, without the usual swell that would ordinarily cause waves to break visibly white against the base of an iceberg, giving lookouts a much easier visual cue at a distance. Several survivors and crew members later described the conditions as unusually, even eerily still. And more than one experienced sailor among them said afterward that they had never seen the North Atlantic that calm on an April crossing. That calm, which felt at the time like good fortune, removed one of the few natural warning signs the lookouts might otherwise have had. There's a further detail about that particular iceberg that I think deserves mention, because it's one of the more genuinely eerie coincidences of the whole night. Some historians have suggested, based on later analysis, that the specific type of iceberg the Titanic struck, one that had recently rolled, exposing a darker, less reflective surface than a fresh iceberg would show, may have been especially difficult to see against the black water that night, even in daylight, let alone in the dark with no moon and no swell to mark its base. I want to be careful not to overstate this, because it edges toward the kind of explanation that makes the disaster feel like bad luck, rather than a chain of decisions, and I don't think that's the whole truth either. But I think it's honest to say that even a fully alert crew, with working binoculars, on a night with slightly worse luck in the iceberg's exact condition, might still have struggled to see it in time. I think the honest position, and the one I'm going to hold across this entire arc, is that both things were true at once. The night was genuinely, unusually difficult. Calm water, no moon, a dark surfaced berg. And the response to that difficulty was genuinely, unnecessarily worse than it needed to be. No binoculars, an unrelayed warning, a speed that didn't account for any of it. Bad luck and bad decisions rarely arrive separately in real disasters. They compound each other, and untangling exactly how much each one contributed is usually less useful than understanding that neither one, alone, would likely have been enough to sink this ship.
The iceberg was sighted by fleet at 11:40 p.m., and the order to turn came within seconds. It wasn't enough. The ship struck the berg along its starboard side, below the waterline, in a glancing impact that opened a series of gashes and buckled seams across roughly 300 feet of hull. Thomas Andrews was aboard that night. He was the ship's builder, the man who had overseen its design and construction, present on this maiden voyage specifically to observe how his creation performed and note anything that needed improvement for future ships in the same class. He was asked within the first hour to inspect the damage. And by every documented account of what followed, he understood immediately, with a precision almost nobody else on board yet possessed, exactly what the damage meant. The ship had been designed to stay afloat with any 2 of its watertight compartments flooded, or, under certain conditions, as many as 4. The collision had damaged 6. Andrews's assessment to Captain Smith, delivered privately, was that the ship had perhaps an hour, or a little more, before it went down. Not might sink, would sink. There was no scenario in his professional judgment in which the ship built to be nearly unsinkable was going to survive the night. I want to sit with the specific horror of that moment, because I think it gets lost in how familiar this story has become. The one man on board who fully understood, immediately and with expert certainty, that everyone was in mortal danger was the man who had built the ship. He knew exactly how it was supposed to fail safely, and he knew, within minutes of inspecting the damage, that it wasn't going to. I've tried, in researching this episode, to imagine what those minutes must have felt like for Andrews specifically. Not the general dread of the ship's other officers, gradually realizing the scale of the danger, but the immediate, complete, expert certainty of a man looking at his own life's work and understanding instantly that it had failed in exactly the way he would have least expected on the one night it could least afford to. It took Captain Smith roughly 25 minutes after receiving that assessment to order the lifeboats uncovered and readied. 25 minutes on a ship where every minute mattered, and where the lifeboats, even used perfectly, loaded to capacity, launched without delay, could not have carried even half the people aboard. I want to say something about what those 25 minutes likely involved, because I don't think it reflects poorly on Captain Smith specifically, so much as it reflects the almost impossible position any captain would have been in that night. Smith had commanded ships for over 4 decades without ever losing one. He was days from retirement by some accounts. He was being asked by his own ship's builder to accept that the vessel he'd been assured was practically unsinkable was going to sink completely within the hour, and to begin an evacuation procedure that had never once been rehearsed at full capacity, using equipment nobody aboard had ever tested under real conditions. 25 minutes to process that, and to begin acting on it, is not, in retrospect,
an unreasonable amount of time for a human being to take. It was, however, 25 minutes the people aboard that ship did not have to spare. I want to describe Andrews himself a little further, because I think his presence on that ship that night is one of the strangest and most tragic details in the entire story. He was 39 years old, widely respected within the shipbuilding industry, and by every account genuinely proud of what his firm had created. He had spent the earlier part of the voyage walking the ship, making notes on small improvements, a coat hook here, a stateroom door that stuck slightly there. Survivors later recalled seeing him, in the ship's final hour, going from room to room, urging passengers who hadn't yet grasped the severity of the situation to put on their lifebelts and get to the boat deck. He did not survive. His body, if recovered at all, was never definitively identified. The man who understood most precisely, most immediately, exactly how badly his own creation had failed, spent his last hour trying to save as many of the people aboard it as he could.
I think about the contrast between Andrews and the wireless operator from the start of this broadcast often, because I think it says something true about how differently individual people respond to the same kind of terrible knowledge. Both men understood, well before most of the ship did, that something had gone badly wrong. The wireless operator kept transmitting distress calls until he could no longer physically do so. Andrews kept walking corridors, knocking on doors, until the water reached him. Neither of their deaths changed the outcome for the ship as a whole, but I don't think that makes what either of them did in those final hours meaningless. I think it's the opposite. When the largest failures are institutional, a missing key, an unenforced protocol, an untested lifeboat system, the only thing left within any single person's control is what they choose to do with the time they have left once the failure has already happened. Both of these men chose to keep working. I am going to go deeper into the lifeboat regulations and why there weren't enough of them in the next episode of this arc, because that story deserves its own full telling rather than a rushed summary here. Tonight, I want to tell you only what happened in the first hour after the boats began loading, because I think it matters that you understand how confused, how improvised, how far from orderly that hour actually was against the popular image of calm, dutiful evacuation. The first boats were launched well under capacity. One, designed to hold 65 people, left the ship carrying 28. Crew members were uncertain whether the davits, the mechanical arms that lowered the boats, could safely bear a fully loaded boat's weight. Nobody had tested this. Nobody in the ship's brief operational life had run a full lifeboat drill with all boats loaded to capacity. So they erred toward caution in a moment that demanded the opposite. And people who could have been saved in those early boats were left standing on deck instead, because the crew loading the boats didn't yet understand how little time was left to correct the error. Women and children first was the standing order issued by Captain Smith. How strictly it was enforced varied significantly from boat to boat, officer to officer, deck to deck. Some crew members interpreted it as women and children only, turning away men who might otherwise have had room. Others allowed men to board once the immediate women and children nearby had been accommodated. There was no single, consistent standard, because there had been no drill, no rehearsal, no shared understanding among the crew of exactly how the order was meant to be carried out under real conditions. This inconsistency would matter enormously to how survival broke down by class, gender, and deck location, a pattern I'm going to examine in full in a future episode of this arc, because it deserves more care than I can give it in the time remaining tonight. What I want you to carry forward from tonight is simpler. The evacuation of the Titanic was not the calm, well-drilled procedure it is sometimes remembered as. It was improvised, under-rehearsed, and inconsistent, on a ship that had never practiced the thing it was now being forced to do for real, for the first and only time, with everyone's life depending on getting it right. I want to describe one specific scene from those early minutes that I think captures the confusion better than any statistic could. On one side of the ship, an officer was refusing to lower boats that weren't full, holding them at deck level while crew searched for more women and children to fill them, even as the ship's list grew more pronounced beneath his feet. On the other side of the ship, a different officer was lowering boats the moment they had any occupants at all, unwilling to risk the delay. Two officers on the same sinking ship at the same time, operating under the same order, arrived at opposite interpretations of what that order actually required of them. Neither was wrong, exactly. Neither had ever been told which interpretation was correct, because nobody had ever expected either of them to need to know. There's a further detail I want to add, one that I think illustrates just how unprepared the ship's own systems were for this exact scenario. Some of the earliest boats to leave carried crew members whose specific duties should have kept them aboard longer, men assigned to help launch later boats, who ended up in early ones instead, through simple confusion about where they were needed. Meanwhile, on the ship's other side, women and children waited on deck for boats that were slow to arrive or slow to fill, watching boats leave half empty on the opposite side, without any means of knowing that space was going to waste just a few hundred feet away. The ship's own geometry, a long vessel, boats spread across both sides, no reliable way to communicate quickly between them in the chaos, worked against any kind of coordinated fairness, even among crew members who genuinely wanted to save as many people as possible. I want to mention one more thing about those first boats, because I think it's easy, looking back with a century of hindsight, to imagine that everyone aboard understood immediately how serious the situation was. Many didn't. Several accounts describe passengers reluctant to board the very first boats, unwilling to leave the warmth and apparent solidity of a ship that still felt to them far safer than a small, open boat lowered into the black Atlantic at night. Crew members had to persuade, and in some cases, nearly force passengers into boats that would go on to save their lives, simply because the danger wasn't yet visible enough to override the instinct that a giant ship must surely be safer than a small one. There's a particular account I want to include here, of a woman who reportedly refused a seat in one of the earliest boats, insisting she would rather wait for her husband to be permitted to join her, not yet understanding that the order in place that night meant he never would be. By the time she accepted a place in a later boat, alone, the ship's list had become impossible to ignore, and the calm reluctance of that first hour had given way entirely to something closer to panic. I think that transition, from mild inconvenience to genuine terror, compressed into roughly 90 minutes, is one of the hardest parts of this story to fully convey, because it happened gradually enough that almost nobody aboard could point to the exact moment they understood the ship was actually going to sink.
I want to close the investigative portion of this broadcast with an account from someone who was aboard that night. I'll call her H. Following the practice this frequency has always used for testimony given under condition of anonymity or at a significant remove of time. She was interviewed decades later, elderly by then,
One of the last living survivors anyone was able to speak to before that generation was gone entirely. She was traveling third class, 8 years old that night, with her mother and 2 younger brothers, emigrating to join her father, who had gone ahead the previous year to find work. She said, "I remember the cold before I remember anything else. Not the ship, not the sound. The cold once we were finally outside, on the boat deck, in night clothes, in April, in the middle of the ocean." I asked her, in the portion of the interview I have access to, how she and her family found their way from third class up to the boat deck, given how far below decks third-class accommodation was located, and given the persistent stories, debated by historians ever since, about gates and barriers separating different classes of passenger. I want to note before her answer that this is one of the more genuinely contested details of the whole disaster, and I don't think it's my place, based on one person's account decades removed, to settle it either way. Some survivors from other parts of the ship did describe locked or guarded gates. Others, like H, describe confusion and length rather than deliberate obstruction. I think both kinds of testimony deserve to be heard, rather than one being used to silence the other. She said, "I don't remember gates. I remember corridors that felt very long and very confusing, and a crew member, I don't remember his face, only that he was kind, and that he seemed to know where he was going when nobody else around us did, who walked with us for part of the way and pointed us in the right direction before he had to go help someone else." She said, "I don't know if every family got a crew member like that. I think about that a great deal. I think about how much luck was involved in which families found someone kind in a corridor and which families didn't." She and her mother and brothers made it into a boat. Her father, waiting in New York, did not yet know his wife and children had been aboard a ship that was sinking, as she told me this story. She said, "The hardest part was not the cold and not the boat, and not even watching the ship go down, which I did see quite clearly from where we sat on the water. The hardest part was the sound afterward. Once the ship was gone, all those voices in the water, and us with an empty boat, half full, that could have held more of them, and being told to stay where we were." I asked her about that specifically, because it's one of the most difficult and most debated details of the entire disaster. The fact that many lifeboats, only partially filled, did not return to pick up survivors from the water after the ship went down, out of fear that a boat overwhelmed by desperate swimmers would capsize and lose everyone already aboard it. She said she understood the fear, as an adult looking back, in a way she hadn't understood it as a child on the water that night. She said, "I've spent most of my life not judging the people in charge of that boat, because I think I understand now what it must have felt like, weighing dozens of lives against the handful already saved. But I want to say honestly, that 8-year-old girl sitting in that boat didn't understand it at all. She just heard the voices get quieter, over time, until they stopped." I asked her whether she remembered anything specific her mother said or did during that hour on the water, waiting for rescue. She said her mother didn't speak much at all, which she found strange to recall now, since her mother had ordinarily been a talkative woman. She said, "I think, looking back, she was doing the arithmetic of what had just happened and what it meant for us going forward, without a husband there yet to help her carry it. She held both my brothers and me as close as the boat allowed, and she hummed, very quietly, something I never recognized and never asked her to name. I think it was just a sound to hold on to, rather than a specific song. I've never forgotten it, even though I couldn't tell you a single note of it today. She and her mother and brothers made it into a boat. Her father, waiting in New York, did not yet know his wife and children had been aboard a ship that was sinking, as she told me this story.
I asked her, near the end of the interview, whether she'd ever gone back to the site or to any memorial or to anything connected to that night in all the decades since. She said she had, once, in her 60s, at the invitation of a historical society that was gathering survivor accounts. She said standing in a room with photographs of the ship for the first time since childhood brought back a physical sensation she hadn't expected. Not fear, she said, but cold. The specific cold of that night, arriving in her body decades later as if no time had passed at all. She told me one more thing, near the very end of the recording, that I've thought about often since. She said, "People ask me sometimes if I'm angry about the key, about the warnings, about all the things you've told me you've researched since. I'm not angry. I was 8. I don't remember being angry, even at the time. I just remember being cold, and being held, and being quiet, because somebody told me quiet was what we needed to be. I think that's most of what a disaster actually is, for the people inside it. Not the big story you tell afterward. Just being cold, and being quiet, and doing what you're told, because you don't have any other choice available to you." I don't have anything to add to that. I don't think anything I could say would carry more weight than what she just told you herself. By 2:20 in the morning, April 15th, 1912, the Titanic was gone. Broken apart by most reconstructions in its final minutes and sunk in roughly 2.5 miles of water. The wireless room kept transmitting almost until the end. Jack Phillips, the same operator who had turned away that final ice warning 6 hours earlier, stayed at his post, sending distress calls long after Captain Smith had formally released him from duty. He did not survive. A ship called the Carpathia, roughly 58 miles away when it received the distress call, altered course immediately and arrived just over an hour after the Titanic sank. It picked up just over 700 survivors from the lifeboats scattered across the dark water. Somewhere between 1,500 and 1,520 people did not make it into a boat, or did not survive the hours in the water and the cold before rescue arrived. I want to describe the Carpathia's response specifically, because I think it deserves to be told alongside everything that went wrong that night, as a counterweight of sorts. Its captain, upon receiving the distress call, ordered the ship to full speed through the same ice field that had doomed the Titanic. A genuinely dangerous decision, made without hesitation, by a man who understood exactly what was being risked, and decided the risk was worth taking. The ship's medical staff prepared for mass casualties through the night. Crew members readied blankets, hot drinks, and rope ladders for survivors too weak to climb aboard unassisted. None of it undoes what happened, but I think it matters that at least one ship that night responded to a crisis with exactly the urgency the situation demanded. And I don't want this broadcast to leave you with the impression that everyone involved failed equally. I want to say a little more about the Carpathia's captain, Arthur Rostron, because I think his response that night deserves to be remembered with the same specificity I've given to everyone whose response fell short. Rostron didn't simply order full speed. He personally supervised the preparation of his own ship for an influx of survivors he had no way of estimating in advance, reallocating cabins, organizing his crew into rescue teams,
and posting extra lookouts of his own specifically because he understood, better than almost anyone that night, exactly what kind of water his ship was now racing through in the dark. He was later honored for his actions, and I think, of everyone whose name appears in this story, his is one of the few that deserves to be remembered without any qualification at all. I told you at the start of this broadcast that I wasn't going to retell the story you already know. I hope what I've given you instead is the version underneath it. A missing key, an interrupted warning, a builder who understood the truth immediately, and a crew that took 25 minutes to act on it, and boats that left half empty because nobody had rehearsed what full looked like. None of these were dramatic villains. Almost all of them were ordinary people doing an ordinary job on the one night ordinary wasn't enough. I want to say something about why I think this version of the story matters more than the mythology before I close tonight. The mythology, the unsinkable ship, the band playing on, the stoic captain going down with his vessel. That version makes the disaster feel almost inevitable, a kind of tragic fate that befell a doomed ship regardless of what anyone did. The version underneath it is more frightening, because it isn't fate. It's a sequence of small, ordinary, correctable decisions made by tired people doing jobs they'd done 100 times before, none of whom had any reason to believe that this particular Wednesday night would be the one where all of it mattered at once. That's a harder story to sit with than fate. Fate absolves everyone. This doesn't. I think that's the whole reason I wanted to open this arc with tonight's episode specifically, rather than jumping straight to the lifeboats or the inquiry. Before we can talk about who failed and how, I think it matters to sit, once, in the version of that night where nobody yet knows they've failed at all. Where a wireless operator is simply tired, and a lookout is simply working with what he's been given, and a captain is simply doing what every captain of his era would have done. I think that version is harder to be angry at, and I think it's also the truer one. I want to close with one final thought, something that stayed with me through every hour of researching this episode. Every single decision I've described tonight, the wireless operator's priority queue, the missing key in David Blair's pocket, the 25 minutes Captain Smith needed to process an impossible truth, the two officers with opposite interpretations of the same order. Every one of those decisions, made in isolation on an ordinary day, would have been completely unremarkable. Ships receive ice warnings constantly and arrive safely anyway. Officers get reassigned at the last minute constantly, and nothing is ever lost because of it. Evacuation procedures go untested on ships that never need them. It was only the specific, catastrophic coincidence of all of these ordinary small failures landing on the exact same night that turned a routine crossing into the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster of its era. I think that's the truest and the most uncomfortable thing this story has to teach. Catastrophe rarely announces itself in advance. It assembles itself quietly, out of decisions nobody thought mattered, until the night it does. To H, wherever you are now, thank you for telling that story before it was lost entirely. I hope the corridor felt less long in the telling than it did that night. I hope the cold that found you again in that room full of photographs eventually let you go. Next time, I want to take you deeper into the lifeboats themselves, why there were so few, whose decision that was, and how a regulation based on a ship's weight, rather than the number of people it carried, was allowed to stand unquestioned for years,
before it was tested against the worst possible night to test it. There is also a ship I've barely mentioned tonight, close enough that night to have changed everything. It didn't answer. I'll tell you why next time. This is last broadcast. The signal returns in 7 days. The wireless is still transmitting somewhere in every account of that night that anyone has ever bothered to listen to closely. I'm listening.